People who are capable of handling simple jobs and then incapable of analyzing. And it's exactly the kind of a person that corporations and oligarchies want. And we are in serious trouble in this country. And I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you.
No disagreement there.
No, we all agree with that.
So I would like to add another failure by the Democrats and Obama, and that has to do with the issue of equality, which I think was a central contributor both to the economic crisis, because when you have growing inequalities under neoliberalism, you have a stagnant economy that leads to financial speculation. And I would add something that nobody talked about during the debate, not even supporters of the single-payer system, which is economic inequality itself, as social epidemiologists have shown, is a big contributor to basically ill health in societies. And this is, so if the indicators, health indicators in the US are much worse than in Europe, it's not just a matter of the healthcare system, it's a matter of inequality. And I would like to connect this to another issue that was shelved right away, and that was the issue, the demand from labor unions to make labor reforms that would make organizing easier. That's an example of a reform that could have addressed this issue of growing inequality that is at the center both of the healthcare crisis and the economic crisis. And of course, the Democrats, I don't agree with Fran, although I like her analysis, I don't agree that this was a bad Congress. I mean, this was a Congress where Democrats had a comfortable majority in the House, they had a super majority in the Senate, and they had a Democratic president. If that's not a good, Congress, I don't know what is, frankly. So, okay, so the last question related, you talked about some things may be starting right now, so I would be interested to hear what you mean by that.
You want me to begin?
Yes.
So to Francis Fox Piven's point that Obama would like to do the right thing, but on big issues, he's hamstrung by the Congress that he's got to work with, by the military-industrial complex, by the financial services industry, if you will. But under the radar, he's trying to do good things on a smaller level. Well, I read this morning that the Environmental Protection Agency, its criminal investigations unit, is actually doing fewer criminal prosecutions than were being done in the Bush years. Now that seems to me to be something that would be easy enough to change, and it seems to be an example of even on little things that he could be doing, he doesn't seem to be. So I wonder if you have any response.
Okay, so the first one there was on the idea of the US being an oligarchy and being run by corporations. Then one on equality and economic inequality linking to healthcare and labor reforms. And finally was what Obama's doing sort of at a lower level under the radar, as Fran said, and elaborating on that. So, Tarek, would you like to respond?
Well, I mean, I don't think there are too many disagreements here on the questions that have been raised. To the first questioner who spoke about what is happening under neoliberal capitalism, oligarchic is a word he used. Sheldon Wolin, the great Princeton political theorist, has just written a book called Democracy, Inc., or not just a few years ago, which maps this process in American politics out very, very clearly. And I think that's accurate, that the symbiosis between money, and big politics has now reached a stage where the very functioning of democracy is threatened. That's what we are witnessing today. And it's almost as if the big period of reforms, tied in with a global situation which was very different. That from 1917 to 1990, you had the existence of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe, which for all its shortcomings and failures and weaknesses and crimes was nonetheless seen in some ways as an alternative, something that could be reformed, and was certainly not capitalism. And it was during that period that you saw most of the democratic and social democratic reforms pushed through in the capitalist world. The collapse of that system also meant the collapse of social democratic reformism, or reformism as such, because the new elites felt that there was no need for it. There was no global enemy, there was no internal enemy. Who are we scared of? We do what we want. And that has helped this process to continue. I agree with you on education. This is a growing problem in the United States, but not exclusively. The situation in Britain is equally bad. And I mean, there are some comparisons actually which to be made between Tony Blair's coming to power, which also created, not on my part personally, but on the part of large numbers of people, massive excitement that here was a politician who could speak well, we'd ended years of Thatcherite rule, etc., etc. And Obama is very similar in many ways to Blair. He's more intelligent, but he is quite similar as a politician, which is a sad business for the United States. I agree with the friend who raised the question about inequality and its links to the worsening health situation. I mean, there are lots of studies which have been done and which demonstrate that very concretely, which is why Michelle Obama's sort of misguided campaign to go on and on about obesity without tackling the actual causes of this obesity, or the huge corporations that make millions producing junk food that makes people obese, is really besides the point and sort of very typical.
Yes, the United States is an oligarchy. It has been oligarchical for a very long time, but with the extremes of inequality surpassing the levels of the 1920s, again, it's become much more oligarchical. This has to do not only with the distribution of income and wealth, it has to do with the distribution of status, of dignity, of the pleasures of life, and political influence. Economic oligarchy has added to it is not the sole source of corruption in American politics, but it has certainly worsened it. Kostas is absolutely right that there is substantial data showing that extreme inequality, and that is the pattern in the United States. You can't grasp the pattern of inequality that that has been produced over the last 30 years by looking at the distribution between quintiles or between deciles. You have to look at the distribution between the top 10th of the top 1%. That's where the wealth has been really concentrated, and you can't have a democratic or even a partially democratic polity. You can't have a sort of culturally sane society with such florid, fatuous consumption dominating the airwaves, dominating the advertising, something most people are left out of. This is not healthy. Well, somebody overstated my position when I said that Obama wanted to do the right thing. I didn't say that. I said he was doing some good things under the radar, good things especially when measured against the rape of the federal bureaucracies that occurred from the 1970s onward. The So, you know, don't overstate my defense of Barack. Are things starting? You know, it's always very hard to tell. Yeah, there are small groups doing stuff, have been for a year or more. You don't know, excepting in retrospect, when these particular incidents combine to form a pattern of spreading insurgency. I don't know. I certainly hope so. I think that is our only hope, in fact.
Oligarchy, we'll stipulate that, although I insist that the oligarchy is run by the two political parties, and that the greatest misunderstanding in political analysis these days is the relationship between the parties and corporations, that the typical relationship between an important politician and a corporation or a corporate executive is a shakedown of the corporation by the politician, not a bribe of the politician by the corporate executive. And that the systematic shaking down of corporate America, which is like paying protection money to a criminal racket, is now so ingrained and so successful that both sides are very, very unwilling to give it up. We've got a Soviet Union style re-election, or Soviet Union level re-election rate in this country. I did the calculations and checked with all the scholars. You know, the re-election rate in this country, and I'm talking from state on up to federal level, is almost always over 95%. In some election cycles, 99%. And this is because nobody, no foundation person, no billionaire, no CEO, nobody has the power in this country of an incumbent congressman, especially a committee chairman, to raise money and make it impossible for somebody to run a primary campaign against them. And that's the fundamental situation with oligarchy in the country. I'm not saying the corporations necessarily object to it. Once in a while, a corporate executive will object to being shaken down. But for the most part, they just keep their mouths shut and pay. And they don't really have that many big ideas. On equality, is that the second one? Well, I mean, even the Black Caucus is angry with Obama. I mean, he's not even taking care of his black constituency. Cornel West was on NPR the other day, and I'm amazed this didn't get more play, describing his last meeting at the White House with Obama, and he said that Obama treated him like a Cub Scout. He said he came over, he sought him out in a gathering, and I can't quote this exactly, and I can't say it as well as Cornel West can say it. He's very funny. But he said he sought him out and he lectured him on having said something critical about the administration and about the increasing inequality, wage inequality, racial inequality in the country. He yelled at him. And he said, I felt like I was being treated like a Cub Scout. And I wondered whether my brother, Barack, would ever talk that way to a white liberal like Paul Krugman or Frank Rich. So that's, and the last one is, I'm sorry.
Was on what's
under the radar. Well, what Obama's doing under the radar is he's raising money. I mean, busy raising money for his re-election campaign and for the congressional campaign committees, although if you saw in the New York Times the other day, there was a story about triage, how the party is going to do brutal triage, where they're going to cut loose certain people they think can't win. Well, that's also a measure of party discipline. You give money to the people you want to reward, and you don't give money from the Central Committee to the people you don't want, you know, that have been disloyal or haven't been loyal enough. But, you know, it was just last year, Obama was doing a fundraiser at the Mandarin Oriental right uptown here at Columbus Circle, and he said, you know, he gave a lot of speeches, but none was more important than the one he delivered to these 200 donors, 1/3 of them employed by Wall Street firms, and each of whom had contributed the legal maximum of $30,400 for the privilege of hearing the speech. And Obama thanked all the heavy hitters and so on and so forth, and the one speech netted the party $6 million. That's what he's doing under the radar.
Just quickly before we go on to more questions, I wanted to, on the issue of economic inequality, I wanted to briefly read a passage from the Obama Syndrome where Tarek quotes from an article by Walter Ben Michaels, which is worth reading. In certain crucial ways, the United States is more unequal than it was 40 years ago. No group dedicated to ending economic inequality would be thinking today about declaring victory and going home. In 1969, the top quintile of American wage earners made 43% of all the money earned in the US. The bottom quintile made 4.1%. In 2007, the top quintile made 49.7%, the bottom quintile 3.4%. And while this inequality is both race and gendered, it's less so than you might think. White people, for example, make up about 70% of the US population, and 62% of those in the bottom quintile. Progress in fighting racism hasn't done them any good. It hasn't even been designed to do them any good. More generally, if we succeeded completely in eliminating the effects of racism and sexism, we would not thereby have made any progress towards economic equality. A society in which white people were proportionately represented in the bottom quintile and black people proportionately represented in the top quintile would not be more equal. It would be exactly as unequal. It would not be more just, it would be proportionately unjust. One, and the gentleman in the black shirt. And then, yes, third.
Okay, I'd like to ask.
Sorry, can you wait for the microphone, please?
Yeah. I'd like to ask the people identify themselves, so I'll begin. My name's Joanne Landy. And I have to say, Francis, the perspective you outlined is very bleak. And it's not only bleak, but I think it's self-destructive for the left and for progressive movements. Because if I can boil down what I understand you to be saying, you're saying only a, quote, pragmatic politician, which to me means a pro-corporate politician, can win. So we should actually hope for them to be pragmatic enough to win, making all the programmatic and substantive compromises that they do, and then we will make the country ungovernable. Now, I think that it doesn't work that way.
That's not what I misunderstood me.
Sure, I don't know how you want to chair it. It's okay.
I can respond?
Yes.
Oh, I said that given what is extremely likely, that a president of the United States is going to be pragmatic, the only way we can change the constellation of forces is by building up the left, building up the bottom, building up movements of minorities, the poor, migrants, students, and working people. That only in the face of such a movement will a pragmatic president bend to his electorate instead of to the interests. That's what I said.
Okay, but so let me go on then, okay? That in the absence of a yet developed progressive movement, it seems to me your logic is we want someone like Obama who will make the necessary compromises in order to win, and then we will have the ability to create that pressure which will create a new pragmatism. Okay, now I just think that, especially in today's world, this is suicidal for us. That the political landscape is moving with lightning speed towards the right because of the kinds of deep concessions that Obama, the moderate, is making to the Tea Partiers and to the right. So I think that Rick MacArthur really put his finger on it when he says it's not just a question of Obama as a person, it's a question of the Democratic Party, which basically Obama represents. And so I think that although it's very difficult to contemplate how to do this, and I don't have a recipe for it, I think we have to, and I don't mean just individuals, but the movements or potential movements in this country have to begin to explore building a different kind of party. Otherwise, we're on a permanent treadmill, which is going to be moving further and further to the right. Just
Just very briefly, or give him a primary. Give Obama a primary. I don't see why this is so unthinkable. Why isn't anybody volunteering to run against him? There's so many unhappy liberals and right-thinking, even liberal Republicans are unhappy with him, the ones who, a lot of whom voted for him. Give him a primary. That's what they do in Chicago. You get out of line, you get punished. No. She waits her turn. She's good about that. She's a good party person, and Hillary Clinton will wait her turn, unless he falls apart.
Kennedy stood against Carter.
Because he was a reformer.
Yeah.
Carter was threatening the structure and the ruling. He was breaking the rules of party hierarchy and party loyalty, and he was really trying to put in reform measures, and he had to be punished. He had to be stopped.
I have a brief question. The systematic attack on civil liberties and the erosion of civil liberties that was carried out in the Bush administration has yet to be addressed by the Obama administration openly. And I think we can't really look at a midterm report card without addressing that problem, because that would be something that does not have a direct effect on his reelection, but it is a very important issue that is having a wider effect within activist groups throughout the United States. So what is your take on the civil liberties issue, which is yet to be addressed by the Obama administration, and it's actually probably gotten worse since he's taken office?
Can we take one more question before we respond?
I'm Michael Smith. I'm on the board at the Center for Constitutional Rights. I didn't mean to address this, but I'll do it very briefly. Obama administration has been a disaster on democratic rights. It's extended what Bush did. I edited a book by Kunstler, and Michael Ratner wrote the introduction, and we called the book The Emerging Police State, and that's precisely what's happened. It hasn't been changed one iota under Obama. It's been reinforced. The last decision that came down, the appellate court out in California ruled on state secrets that bin Yamid Mohammed, who was a British citizen, was in Pakistan, was picked up by the CIA and put on a CIA front airline. There was a lawsuit against the front airline, and the lawsuit was heard in the district court below, and the Obama administration argued for state secrets. It said this man, Mohammed, cannot bring a lawsuit even though he was flown by a CIA airline to Morocco, where his testicles were sliced open with a scalpel and hot stinging liquid was poured into them. And they said he cannot avail himself of an American court. The judge was incredulous, and he said, "There's just been an election. Aren't you going to change your position?" And the Obama Justice Department guy said, "No." Well, the judge ruled in our favor, and the case was appealed to the appellate court, and we lost 2-1, with, again, the Obama administration taking the position that it was state secrets. And incidentally, there was no state, it was all public. Jane Mayer had revealed the whole thing in the New Yorker. There was no secrets that were going to be revealed in this trial, but Obama was protecting the CIA. You know, remember, we have to look forward, not backward. I wrote a long article about this, and I quoted a lot of the center's studies on this. It's michaelstevensmith.com is my blog, and you can, and it's in there. But I have a question. And the question is this. Leslie Stahl interviewed Madeleine Albright when she was Secretary of State, and she said, Madam Secretary, 600,000 children have died under the sanctions with children in Iraq. Do you think this was justified? And Albright thought for a second and said, yes. Later on, 1 million people died in Iraq. And at the eve, and this is my question, at the eve of World War I, Rosa Luxemburg posed the alternative for humanity. And she said it's either socialism or barbarism. And my question is, do you panelists see that as the alternative? And secondly, what do you do as intellectual leftists, like in this room? What do you do to articulate that?
To I mean, the question has partially been answered, and in my book, I make the same point, that even on this subject, on which during the Bush administration, Obama and others had talked about the assault on civil liberties. Once they came into office, very little was done. And the Obama administration here too carried on with the policies of the Bush administration. I mean, all the evidence is there. Some of it is in my book. Quite a lot of it is on websites. And the failure to change what had been going on is quite serious, because it has helped to inflame Islamophobia, which is less in the United States than in Europe, by the way. But it is growing here too.
We're catching up.
Yeah, you are catching up. And this absurd brouhaha about the cultural center, which included a mosque, which was going to be built next to Ground Zero. I mean, it's a grotesque business. That people, serious people, can get involved in this and not just say that, you know, the mayor of New York, Bloomberg, has said it should be, that's it, move on. And all the time, coming and going on this question, you know, which is part in the way this administration functions, that it can't respond to the pressures which come from the right by speaking up, putting the arguments clearly. And one thing, I mean, amongst others, Franz said, which I disagreed with, it is difficult to mobilize support if you want to, but it's not impossible. I mean, after all, the right is doing it. Not in millions, but in tens of thousands. They are doing it. They do it on the health issue. They're doing it on other issues, and the response from the Democrats is virtually nil. And that's why I said in my initial contribution, what are you going to do with this list of 13 million supporters you've got on the web if you can't mobilize them? I mean, Roosevelt used to engage in direct conversations with citizens in the fireside chat, saying this is what's going on. Even Kennedy took on the steel barons and called them sons of bitches and stuff like that. No, he did. So it's just that what has happened to politics over the last 20 years is such that the center left, or what passes for that, globally and in the United States, has basically lost the urge and the capacity to resist. And this is what makes the situation very dangerous. What you said is true. The civil liberties situation here is not good. And it will carry on worsening unless politicians stand up and are counted. It's straightforward as that. As to the other question, socialism or barbarism, well, we've been hearing about this, you know, for the whole of the last century. It's a question which never goes away. Socialism seems extremely unlikely at the moment anyway. In the sense in which Rosa Luxemburg understood it, and the barbaric tendencies within capitalism can be seen. I mean, the fact that 1 million Iraqis have died. Just think about it for a minute. 1 million Iraqis have died since the occupation of that country. That country's entire social infrastructure, which was relatively advanced, has been wiped out. And citizens of the West, most of them, not all of them, sleepwalk from one day to the other, from one disaster to the other. And this is dangerous. Now, it's not true that they were always like this. They have their ups and downs. I mean, who can forget the amazing, huge effort made by citizens all over the world to try and stop the Iraq War? Before the war actually happened, millions and millions of people came out, all over, including in this country. Despite 9/11, they came out, huge demos in New York on the West Coast, but they failed. And they were not mainly people from the left, they were citizens who thought that the politicians were lying to them. And that failure to stop that war went deep, unfortunately. It disillusioned many people with politics per se. And that is the problem which we will find now. It's not that the Tea Party crowd can defeat Obama or Sarah Palin. It's that his own supporters will stay at home.
You know, I think historically, anti-war movements, especially at the onset of wars, have rarely succeeded because they have been pitted against the ability of state leaders to invoke the flag, patria, the jingoism that people are very susceptible to. Sometimes, as wars drag on, anti-war movements do arise. But even in the case of the Vietnam War in the United States, I think the cutting edge of the anti-war movement was not the big demonstrations in Washington, but it was the fact that the foot soldiers in the U.S. Army would no longer obey orders, and that scared the brass. I want to say something about movements of resistance. You know, FDR did speak to the people, and he was the great communicator, and actually Ronald Reagan knew that, had a lot of respect for FDR, but he was not a movement leader. He didn't, FDR.
Oh, right.
No, he didn't mobilize the movements. The movements were mobilized by all sorts of people, activists, agitators, socialists, communists, just labor activists. And, you know, the rent strikes and rent parties in Harlem, actions in Chicago, in the in the Chicago Black Belt, where people went through the streets calling on their neighbors to go put the furniture back in the apartment from which somebody had been evicted. Those were the movement leaders of the 1930s. Can it happen again? Well, you know, we say, oh, nothing's happening, nothing's happening, nothing's happening. In the summer of 1932, journalists uniformly pronounced, nothing is happening. The New Yorker editorialized, I'm going back to cultivating my vegetable garden because people are just taking it on the chin. And as 33 wore on, as 34 wore on, there were general strikes in a series of American cities. The labor agitation was spreading. The journalists were wrong. There was stuff happening in 32, but it wasn't big enough to capture the imagination of the journalists who were looking for something like a revolutionary army, I suppose. You know, I want to say something about Michael's question, socialism or barbarism. You know, the United States and most countries in the world have had regimes that were capable of barbarism. There's no question about that. But I don't think that we can have a mass movement for socialism. We have to have a mass movement about the concrete issues that affect people's lives. And yes, we can account for those pains, those grievances, in terms that reveal the distortions of our society. But we don't start out by, I don't think we can start out by calling for socialism. We have to press as hard as we can for reforms that remedy unemployment, poverty, ill health, obesity, civil liberties violations, a rotten educational system. We have to press for those reforms. And it's when the institutions within which we live and our leadership cannot answer our demands that we can begin to talk about bigger transformations. But we have to press as hard as we can for the things that people can see, feel, that hurt them, and where they can see some solutions, and then when those solutions are denied, we can go further.
Very quickly, I mean, anybody who thought that Obama was going to change the civil liberties situation was sadly misinformed. He was always a follower in the Illinois legislature on criminal reform, never a leader. He greatly exaggerated his role in the criminal justice reform in the state legislature. And this is, believe me, I know what I'm talking about when it comes to the way the cops behave in Chicago and the way civil liberties are systematically violated in all sorts of ways. And I know the civil liberties bar in Chicago very well. He's never thought of as a leader. So it's not a great surprise to me that he's basically hewed to the status quo. Most civil liberties lawyers will tell you that the government's position on all the great issues of the day, the things that matter to them, are exactly the same. Nothing has changed since Bush left. Now, very quickly, I forgot to mention education. My goodness, and inequality, and I'll get to socialism. Does anybody know anything about Arne Duncan?
Yeah.
I mean, this is some kind of a joke to suggest that a guy coming out of Chicago, he's a real teach to the test type, which just appalls me. One of these results-oriented types who says that, sort of thinks of an education as a profit center. Giuliani used to talk like that a lot. If you can't get a job, you know, out of it, if there's no return on your investment, that kind of talk. But worse than that, it's not so surprising. That's in the wind. That's the prevailing philosophy of the day about public education, is to sort of privatize it even within the public school structure. But Obama, again, comes out of Chicago, where the Catholic elite sends its children to parochial school. Nobody in the political elite of the Democratic machine sends their kid, or hardly anybody sends their kids to public school in Chicago. It's just not done. And Obama, no fool, sends his kids to a nice private school in Washington, doesn't put them in public school to set an example. You know, Jimmy Carter put Amy in a public school. It instantly became the best public school in Washington, and probably the same thing would have happened with Obama's kids. But he doesn't see it that way. He sees it from a Chicago perspective, where only the dummies and the lower class Poles and blacks send their kids to public school. You send them to a Catholic school or to a good private school if you can get the money together. On socialism, what to do? You know, what are we to do? I'm more optimistic about sort of liberal Republicans than I am about Democrats. And I write about one in You Can't Be President, a woman named Connie Harding, who had nothing to do with politics in her life, lives in Portsmouth, Rhode Island, and they tried to move a big box, a Target, into the empty lot next to her house, and she and her neighbors got together and they organized and they stopped it. They did everything right. They were brilliant, instinctive organizers. They took direct action, and they scared the hell out of the Portsmouth political establishment, such as it is. And there's a political establishment everywhere. And more, I think that even though I think it's nice when people run primaries, if they can afford to do it, and if they can take the punishment and the insults and go through the fundraising and all that, it's a good thing to run primaries against incumbents. Probably a better way to spend your time is with direct action, community organizing, like Connie Harding in Portsmouth. And she is no left-winger, let me tell you. But she found common cause with her liberal neighbors, some of them liberal, some of them conservatives. We don't want a big box store ruining our town. And I'll just tell you, just an anecdote, Obama stood aside in Chicago and said nothing when the big box minimum wage fight took place in Chicago, which I'm sure none of you know about, where the city council, in a rare rebellion, tried to raise the minimum wage for anybody working in a big box store. Daley vetoed it. and Obama never took a position, never said a word about it. They still don't, they never were able to pass the big box minimum wage.
Can I just interject something? The most effective federation of community organizations, since you raised that, Rick, in the country, ACORN, was destroyed over the course of 4 or 5 years by the right. It now is effectively defunct. It was it was the biggest and most militant federation. It was responsible for successful living wage campaigns all over the country, and it mobilized a lot of low-income and African-American voters. And it was primarily a low-income, working-class African-American federation of organizations, and nobody came to its defense.
Obama didn't come to his defense.
What?
Obama didn't come to his defense.
Right, and neither did most people.
We haven't actually got time for another round of questions, I'm afraid, but I just wanted any closing remarks from of optimism or
September 29th in Europe, the general strike, the multinational general strike coming in Europe.
Yeah, we hope so, but it'll be more effective in some countries than others. But people are beginning to talk about industrial action against the cuts. The politicians, not the politicians, very few politicians involved with it. It's largely grassroots organizations, trade unions, labor movements. We'll see what happens. I mean, there is a small surge taking place, and as always, when you have conservative governments in power, trade unions become a bit more active than they were when their own parties were in power. It just is a fact. So there has been a big discussion at the Trades Union Congress in Britain about how to fight the cuts, and that includes industrial action. But we will see. We will see. I'm not, by temperament, I'm not a pessimistic person, but I am quite a realist.
On that note, thanks to all three of you for coming along, and for everyone. Yes, for people that want it, yes. Yeah. Is that okay with you? Are you okay to do that for 10 minutes?
Yeah.